Good afternoon. My name is Isabel. I'm the Deputy Director of the JDC Global Archives, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar in the context of the Ruth and David Mercer JDC Archives Fellowship. I would like to start by saying a few words about the JDC Archives. We hold the records of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, also known as JDC or the Joint, which is the leading Jewish humanitarian organization. Our collection includes millions of documents, as well as hundreds of photographs, hundreds of artifacts, as well as audio, video, and film recordings dating back to the founding of the organization in 1914. Visiting scholars from around the world, as well as filmmakers, genealogists, journalists, and others use our collections for their research. We also offer fellowships to enable scholars to conduct research in our archives. One of these fellowships is the Ruth and David Mercer JDC Archives Fellowship, which was established thanks to a generous gift from Ruth and David Mercer. Ruth and David Mercer are supporters of JDC with a long-term commitment to Jewish education and academic research and scholarship. On behalf of the JDC Archives, I would like to thank Ruth and David Mercer, who are with us today, for their generosity in endowing this fellowship. David Mercer will actually introduce our speaker today, Alexandra Zborovsky, known as Sasha, who is the recipient of the 2024 Ruth and David Mercer JDC Archives Fellowship. After David's introduction, Sasha will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes. This will be followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Please note that your microphones are muted, but you can send us your questions at any time during and after the lecture via the Q&A function on Zoom. David Mercer will now introduce Alexandra Zborovsky.
Alexandra Zborovsky, who goes by Sasha Zborovsky, is a PhD candidate in the history department at the University of Pennsylvania, studying the history of the Soviet Union and transnational Jewish history. Her dissertation project, preliminary titled, "Should I Stay or Should I Go? Jewish Repatriation, Family Reunification, and Emigration from the USSR 1945 to 1995, explores the emigration of over 1 million Jews from the former Soviet Union across the mid to late 20th century. She investigates not only these émigrés' experiences as they circumvented the Soviet Union's autocratic mobility regime, but the diplomatic clashes between the USSR, United States, and Israel that surrounded their departure. She has been awarded fellowships from the American Jewish Historical Society, the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and the Open Society Archives. She recently completed a year-long fellowship at the Center for Jewish History in New York City. She is the recipient of the 2024 Ruth and David Mercer JDC Archives Fellowship. Alexandra Zborovsky will now start her lecture.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today, and let's take it away. Before I get started, I would like to thank Ruth and David Mercer for helping fund this wonderful year of research at the JDC and for giving me the opportunity to share my work with all of you. So welcome to my talk, Jewish Refugees in the Age of the Jewish Nation, Soviet Jews as Cold War Refugees or Israeli Repatriates, 1970 through 1991. On March 12, 1980, the executive vice president of the United Highest Service, Gaynor Jacobson, received a letter from Jerusalem. Jacobson and his colleagues manned a joint venture between the century-old Jewish aid organizations, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, or HIAS, and the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or the JDC. The two had respectively emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and dedicated much of their efforts to assisting Jewish emigres from Eastern Europe. By the 1970s, they had become organizations of international renown, with HIAS even serving as the United States government's leading subcontractor for all refugee resettlement. But the ever-increasing deluge of tens of thousands of Jewish refugees from the Soviet Union into Vienna's Südbahnhof, pictured here, thrust the two organizations back to their Eastern European Jewish roots. Indeed, the letter sent to Jacobson concerned these very migrants. The letterhead bore the stamp of the Israeli Prime Minister's Bureau. Its author, Yehuda Avner, the advisor to Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, hoped its contents might clarify and resolve a question increasingly dividing the Jewish Agency, which is the Israeli nonprofit that encourages and oversees the immigration of Jews in the diaspora to Israel, and between the American Jewish philanthropic organizations. The question at hand: were Soviet Jews refugees? Avner offered not merely an answer, but a theoretical reorientation. It did not matter whether the United States classified the tens of thousands of newly stateless Jews leaving the Soviet Union as refugees. Avner asserted, quote, and you can see it here, "With Israel, a Jew on the road, any Jew, has the address in his pocket and the key to the door of his own homeland. He is not homeless and needs no one to intercede on his behalf in search of a place to unpack his bags. Therefore, he is not a wandering refugee." End quote. The debate surrounding the validity of Jewish refugeehood was not a mere hypothetical. Any resolution to the question would affect the fate of hundreds of thousands of Jews leaving the Soviet Union, and in fact, any Jew in the diaspora who might one day find themselves forced to flee their state of residence. By the 1980s, American Jewish Philanthropies and the Jewish Agency for Israel had already spent the better part of a decade debating Soviet Jews' freedom of movement, and the resort to parsing the mechanics of refugeehood was the latest manifestation. However, this edition of the debate was particularly ironic. It undermined the Jewish roots of modern refugeehood, but also threatened to standardize the treatment of Jewish refugees with that of other refugees. Repatriation, or the return of individuals to their country of origin or nationality, was the United Nations' professed favorite of the durable solutions to displacement for much of the mid to late 20th century and even today. But in the immediate years after the Holocaust, stateless Jews were one of the few exceptions to that preference. The two-decade-long clash between HIAS, the JDC, and varying branches of the Israeli government reflected not only how states and world leaders engaged terms such as repatriate, parolee, refugee, and citizen in order to control the mobility of Jews departing the Soviet Union, but how the conclusion of the Cold Wars firmly ended the Jewish exception to a global mobility regime that runs on the logic of repatriation. Just 35 years prior to Jacobson and Avner's confrontation, the European continent encountered the greatest displacement crisis of the 20th century. As the Second World War ended, heads of state, prominent lawyers, diplomats, and NGOs deliberated how to not only reconstruct ruined cities and re-stimulate broken economies, but how to resettle millions of displaced persons, DPs, scattered across the European continent, hundreds of miles from where they began the decade and the war. The international effort to resolve this crisis established repatriation as the preferred method for addressing displacement. But the particular conditions affecting displaced Western and Central European Jewish survivors of the Holocaust revealed that this framework needed exceptions. The migratory paths that these Jews pursued and the resulting legal frameworks that arose around them created the foundation for modern refugeehood. This fraught mobility regime, caught between the stateless refugee and the nation state, is the one that Soviet Jews encountered upon exiting the USSR 2.5 decades later. And so I now take us back in time to see how this foundation was built. In 1945, repatriation, or the return of peoples to their countries of origin or nationality, ruled the day. Victorious armies, the newly emergent United Nations, and NGOs resolved to send displaced persons to their respective states of origin. In the greatest modern unmixing on the European continent, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, sent Italians back to Italy, Belgians back to Belgium, and so on. But for the Soviet Union and the United States, the seemingly joint dedication to repatriating DPs was a guise for emerging ideological fault lines. As the newly formed United Nations outlined methods for repatriation, the emerging victors of the Second World War set boundaries. The Soviet Union did not sanction the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and embraced its own interpretation of repatriation, which takes us to the first little green square we have here, focusing on the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. The Soviet Union's interpretation of repatriation hinged on both the forced and voluntary exchanges of citizenship. Soviet citizens of Polish nationality became Polish citizens. Ukrainians once of Romanian citizenship became Soviet citizens in a Ukrainian republic. I know that's a mouthful, but imagine how it felt for the people involved. The United States set its own boundaries. It withdrew from UNRWA in 1946, condemning the organization's acquiescence to the USSR's forced repatriations. Despite this foreshadowing of the Cold War, neither empire actually questioned the inherent logic of repatriation. Rather, they just parsed its details and in execution. Within just a few years, UNRWA had sent millions of displaced persons back to their country of their nationality or origin. As a doctrine, repatriation was undermined not by states, but by the continued existence of displaced persons. In a post-war system determined to bind displaced persons to nation states, the birth of modern refugeehood lay in certain DPs' inability or refusal to repatriate. Though hundreds of thousands of displaced persons attempted to evade repatriations, many of them Soviet citizens abroad, Western and Central European Jews quickly became the quintessential representatives of this category of peoples. And despite their respective interpretations of repatriation, the United States, United Nations, and Soviet Union shockingly reached a point of relative consensus on the fate of Jewish TPs, specifically in Western and Central Europe. They identified displaced person Jews as an ideal type community of victims. Overrepresented in the post-war DP camp system, they were not merely displaced, but as survivors of state-sponsored genocide, utterly stateless. Indeed, in 1946, when the United Nations founded the International Refugee Organization, IRO, to resettle those with, quote, valid objections to repatriation, end quote, DPs of Jewish origin were not required to produce evidence of that objection. It was basically an international given that Jews were quote, non-repatriables, end quote. Even after the United States, Soviet Union, and UN deemed the managed movement of Jews to mandate Palestine the best solution to resolving the Jewish DP crisis, they actually did not cast this supervised migration of Jews to mandate Palestine as a repatriation. On the contrary, they termed it, quote, an alternative to repatriation, end quote. Mandate Palestine was not the destination of choice for the IRO because it was the ancient patris of the Judean people, but rather, as aptly described by historian Deborah Dwork, it was where Jewish refugees believed they were wanted and consequently where Jewish refugees wanted to go. Ironically, from the perspective of Western states and NGOs, Jewish refugees' journey to the territory that soon became a Jewish nation state was one of the few official post-war migrations that neither states, nor the UN, nor independent agencies considered a repatriation. By 1951, when the UN's Refugee Convention institutionalized the modern definition of refugee, it did so with the circumstances of Jewish displaced persons in mind. The writer's emphasis on the fear of persecution in the text was a direct allusion to Jews' wartime experiences. Intertwined with Jews' aforementioned so-called unrepatriability was the writer's insistence that refugees stood apart from aliens. Aliens retained a home country that could theoretically act on their behalf, while a home country that could theoretically act on their behalf, while refugees did not. The convention's chief architect, Jacob Robinson, was a Lithuanian Jew and a former advisor to the United States chief prosecutor at Nuremberg. Of the 29 non-governmental organizations who consulted the convention, 5 specifically represented Jews, and historians have revealed that these organizations exercised an outsized influence on the convention. Although the after effects of imperial partitions in the Cold War would expand the term refugee to include millions of new victims of displacement, the United Nations' modern definition of refugeehood was inextricable from the Jewish case. Now we turn to the United States. While refugeehood on the international stage was rooted in the particularities of Jewish displacement, that in the United States was inherently linked to the Cold War. The United States 1948 Displaced Persons Act was fraught with anti-Semitic clauses and far more concerned with establishing a bulwark against communism than rescuing Jewish refugees. Even in 1950, when an amendment to the act opened the door to Eastern European Holocaust survivors, it was quickly undone by the McCarran-Walter Act, which discriminated against emigres from the Eastern Bloc and threatened to weed out supposed communist infiltration. Only by the decade's close, as the USSR's violent crackdowns on dissent in the Eastern Bloc propelled citizens of the Hungarian Democratic Republic into the West, did the United States government positively tether refugee status to escapees from communist states, and it did so with a vigor. By the 1960s, the United States significantly expanded its refugee apparatus and cast the model American refugee as a fugitive from communism. Despite the United States, United Nations, and USSR's consensus that Jewish refugees fell outside the schema of nationalized post-war repatriations, Jewish leaders in Mandate Palestine, now Israel, and Zionists abroad disagreed. To them, the arrival of Jewish refugees in the Middle East was a repatriation, not unlike those sweeping the European continent. The full extent of these sentiments was muted until it appeared that Jewish refugees might have a choice in the destination of their resettlement. While the 1950 amendment of the Displaced Persons Act was a triumph for American Jewish organizations that had fiercely lobbied for it, for more expressly Zionist Jews, it generated private concern that, quote, fewer European Jews would resettle in Israel if the possibility existed of getting into the United States, end quote. Israel's increasingly national interpretation of Jewish migration became particularly apparent in its treatment of its own emigres. In the decades following Israel's establishment, almost 200,000 people absconded the new state. They returned, for the most part, to DP camps in Western Germany and gambled on resettling in Canada or the United States. These emigres became known as Yordim, the Hebrew term for those who have descended. The term was a foil to the term olim, or those who have risen, which is typically bestowed upon Jewish immigrants to Israel. For a fledgling nation state, these emigres were not merely a PR nightmare, but a threat to the construction of a robust Israeli citizenship. To combat this reality, the Israeli Foreign Ministry took on several strategies. Among them, it implored Western states to exclude Israeli emigres from programs supporting communist refugees, even if these emigres had originally come from the Eastern Bloc. It convinced Jewish aid organizations, such as the JDC and Hayas, to exclude these emigres from their services. It argued that these emigres had already firmly resettled in Israel as citizens, and therefore they could no longer claim Eastern Bloc refugee-oriented aid. Indeed, many states and Jewish organizations followed suit, and in doing so participated in the nationalization of Israel as a site of Jewish repatriation. For the Israeli government, and increasingly on the world stage, Jews who had spent even a brief span in Israel had relinquished their status as unrepatriable refugees and become a far more common type of migrant, a voluntary one from a sovereign nation state. So, now that we've set this foundation, we flash forward. When the first train cars of Jews from the Soviet Union rolled into Vienna, barely 20 years had passed since the post-war accords and discords between the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Nations on the fate of World War II displaced persons. Even less time had elapsed since Israel's management of recurring waves of Yordim. Nevertheless, the inconsistent vocabularies and procedures that emerged from these aforementioned historical circumstances set the terms of the debate that determined Soviet Jews' fate as migrants. Soviet Jews arriving in Vienna at the dawn of the 1970s, as pictured here, were not the first to depart from the post-war USSR. The USSR had permitted trickles of a few hundred Jews to leave the Soviet state directly to Israel, and moreover, in the late 1950s, tens of thousands of Jews from the USSR arrived in Israel after initially repatriating to Poland and subsequently taking advantage of the Polish People's Republic's softer outlook on emigration. Soviet Jews were not the only ones fighting for their departure. The Israeli government had spent the better half of 2 decades, first directly and then clandestinely, lobbying the Soviet state and the international community to permit Jewish immigration from the USSR to Israel. It even established a covert government liaison office whose primary task was to encourage Soviet Jews to emigrate from the USSR. Christian Nativ, pun intended with the christened, this mission sent Israeli ambassadors across the USSR to visit synagogues, distribute literature on Israel, and encourage Hebrew language and Jewish religious education. It dispatched lobbyists to the United States to elevate the diplomatic salience of Soviet Jewish mobility. These efforts came to an outward success in 1966, when Soviet statesman Alexei Kosygin publicly promised Soviet Jewish citizens with kin abroad the permission to emigrate in the name of family reunification. Partially honoring its promise, the Soviet state increasingly permitted its Jewish citizens to emigrate, predominantly through the Israeli embassy in Moscow, on the condition that such Jews be stripped of their Soviet citizenship from the moment of their departure. But this rapport between the Israeli embassy in Moscow and the USSR did not hold. Just a few years after Kosygin's statement, a series of diplomatic agreements and disagreements all but guaranteed that future Soviet Jewish emigres significantly differed from those who left before 1970. How so? After the 1967 Six-Day War, the USSR severed diplomatic relations with Israel. The terms of Soviet Jews' movement could no longer be set through bilateral agreements between two states. Instead, Soviet Jews became subject to the multiple, tenuously linked mobility regimes of Western-aligned states that we established earlier. A third-party state now needed to represent Israel in the USSR, which the Netherlands promptly did. A third-party state needed to volunteer itself as a transit point, which Bruno Kreisky's Austrian government did in 1970. And what emerged was a unique loophole previously unavailable to the few thousand emigres who left the USSR for Israel after Kosygin's statement. Now, instead of immediately arriving to Israel, Soviet Jews boarded boats, flights, and trains bearing Israeli visas, but they did not deboard as Israeli citizens. Rather, they arrived in Vienna as stateless people, making them, according to most post-war definitions, refugees. The international dedication to Soviet Jews was one of the defining human rights movements of the 1970s, in many ways emblematic of the international resurgence of human rights as a calling card in the West in that decade. Even the original author of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, renowned French Jewish jurist René Cassin, weighed in on Soviet Jewry, writing that the freedom of movement was the indestructible core of all human rights, and in doing so cemented that Soviet Jews' fate was entangled with the promises of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Ironically, these evocations about about Soviet Jews' human rights had nothing to do with Soviet Jews' aforementioned statelessness. Western human rights crusaders' obsession with Soviet Jews' freedom of movement was one-sided, directed only on the first half of any migration process, emigration with an E. Indeed, it was a worthy cause. The Soviet state had not ratified the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and consequently did not guarantee its citizens the right to emigrate. Exiting the USSR functioned as a state-granted privilege for which one applied. And as Jews began increasingly applying for exit visas throughout the late 1960s and 1970s, they were subject to demeaning bureaucratic abuses, leaving certain Jews penniless, or I suppose rubleless, in legal limbo, separated from their family members, and in extreme cases in Siberian prisons. But even René Cassin overlooked the crux of the matter. While he noted Jews' right to choose whether to leave the Soviet Union, the issue of choosing where they went escaped his notice. States, NGOs, and individuals who fought for Soviet Jews' access to emigration with an E rarely concerned themselves with the latter immigration with an I rights. The circumstances surrounding Soviet Jews' exit seemingly justified this lack of consideration. Condemning the Eastern Bloc's and Soviet Union's moratorium on emigration fit the zeitgeist of the Cold War. Soviet defectors and dissidents, Hungarian and Czech escapees made headlines. For the United States, the USSR's restriction of Jewish emigration was a perfect addition to the latter's long list of iniquities. Furthermore, as previously mentioned, the Israeli government and American Jews had invested in organizing voters and lobbying congressmen on the issue of Soviet Jewish emigration. And even on the level of internationally codified human rights rhetoric, both the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the newly penned 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights were unequivocal about the right to leave. It was on the right to entry that they were circumscribed. Not to mention, the immigration leg of Soviet Jews' journeys was ostensibly solved. In a global environment where the majority of refugees found few states willing to accept them, Soviet Jews allegedly possessed a nation-state perfectly willing to receive them. In an unusual subversion of typical migration chronologies, Israel had openly campaigned to accept Soviet Jews before the majority had ever considered leaving. But now, as stateless refugees in Vienna, Soviet Jews were no longer logistically bound to resettlement in Israel. Literally, the plane, the train, the boat did not land there. While the campaign for Soviet Jews' emigration had garnered almost unanimous support from Western states, Jews, and human rights activists, the case for Soviet Jews' immigration generated deep division between all three. It resurrected the terms of debate that determined the fate of Jewish and non-Jewish DPs in the immediate post-war era. Terms such as repatriate and refugee returned with a vengeance, often at one another's throats. But they did so largely outside the public sphere. Instead, they remained confined to private exchanges and heated meetings between American Jewish organizations and Israeli officials, only occasionally trickling into Israeli or American Jewish presses. The first dispute regarding Soviet Jewish immigration began over a term with less international renown than repatriate or refugee, but one strikingly familiar to both the Israeli government and American Jewish aid organizations, Yordim, or as the Soviet newspaper Izvestia called them, Beglitzi iz Raya, runaways from paradise. Between 1970 and 1972, Soviet Jewish immigration to Israel took off at an unprecedented rate. And under Israeli nationality law, these denaturalized Soviet Jews acquired Israeli nationality from the day of their immigration, so their entry into the country. This exchange of Soviet citizenship for Israeli citizenship seamlessly followed the tradition of the post-war repatriations that the Soviet Union had embraced in the late 40s and early 50s. The only development was the brief 2 to 3 day bout of statelessness that Soviet Jews encountered in Vienna. But upon arriving on Israeli soil, this stateless status disappeared as though it had never existed. And with every passing day, Soviet Jews were further ingrained into the mechanisms of Israeli citizenship. They were put under the care of the aforementioned Jewish Agency of Israel to ease their integration. After 3 months of residence, Soviet Jews could no longer relinquish their Israeli citizenship. And after 1 year, Soviet Jews acquired an Israeli passport. Consequently, any Soviet Jew who departed from Israel after 3 months of residency did so as an Israeli national and after 1 year as a fully integrated Israeli citizen. This moniker of Yored, the Hebrew singular of Yordim, reemerged to describe the trickle of Soviet Jews who, as early as 1971, departed Israel in dissatisfaction. In other areas of my work, I describe the myriad reasons driving particular groups of Soviet Jews to depart from Israel, which ranged from the lack of STEM jobs to many emigres avowing that they detested the climate, to some emigres who found mixed Jewish, non-Jewish marriages difficult to manage in Israel. Today, however, I would like to direct us to the legal and ideological paradoxes that these Soviet Jewish emigres from Israel propagated. With their newly printed Israeli passports in hand, small groups of Soviet Jews, now emigres from Israel, headed to Rome, the nearest and cheapest location of a United States immigration and naturalization services that processed prospective refugees. Upon arriving in Rome, they typically sought out the international Jewish philanthropies who had made their reputation in supporting Jews across the globe, the aforementioned HIAS and the JDC. And here on my slides, you'll see a bit of a breakdown. We have the Jewish Agency for Israel, which is a parastatal Israeli organization, in that it's half the government, but half not really. And then HIAS and the JDC, which are fully non-governmental organizations. These organizations, HIAS and the JDC, had made an international name for themselves. Even in the Soviet Union, Jews had institutional knowledge of the two philanthropies. The JDC in particular had sent aid to Jews in the USSR throughout the Second World War, was publicly condemned during Stalin's anti-Semitic, anti-cosmopolitan campaigns in the 1950s, and into the 1970s occasionally cropped up in Soviet newspapers. As they encountered so-called Yordim in Rome, the rhymes of history were not lost on either HIAS or the JDC. Longtime employees felt a sense of déjà vu as they recalled the work they dedicated, and eventually were forbidden from dedicating, to the Jewish DP emigres who departed Israel in the 40s and 50s. Moreover, HIAS and the JDC were even more unsure of their role in the 70s. In decades past, they had agreed not to support Israeli emigres and to dedicate their resources only to stateless Jews. But the DP crisis of the post-war decade had passed. Could they now assist Soviet Jews with Israeli passports who no longer wished to reside in Israel? Or would doing so infringe on Israeli sovereignty? In the months that followed, a series of heated exchanges between American Jewish organizations and the Israeli government decided the fate of Soviet Jewish emigres from Israel. Cases for and against assisting these emigres was shrouded in not only legal terms, which deconstructed the nuances of the Israeli law of return, but in ideological moral language that hoped to square the relationship between national and international Jewish organizations. One representative of the JDC affirmed, quote, "Once Russian Jews reach Israel, international Jewish organizations should be discharged of their moral obligation to them," end quote. His colleague cautioned against this approach, reminding that although Israeli Jewish emigres in the 40s and 50s had encountered similar roadblocks, they still successfully found avenues to immigrate elsewhere, and in the process, some had developed negative sentiments towards Jewish organizations. Israeli officials were more united on the matter than American Jewish organizations. Consistent with the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the UN Refugee Convention, they promoted a freedom of movement that allowed for unrestricted Jewish emigration with an E from Israel. After all, quote, "Israel was a free country," end quote. But like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights itself, Israel favored state sovereignty, in this case, of course, its own, over the unfettered freedom of immigration, in this case, of Israeli citizens to other states. By the fall of 1973, HIAS and the JDC reached an agreement with the Israeli government that they would not financially or legally assist Soviet Jewish emigres from Israel in Rome. The agreement struck between the Israeli government, HIAS, and the JDC bound Yordim to the repatriation model that had firmly emerged after the Second World War. Moreover, it excluded these emigres from the international networks of Jewish philanthropy that had once assembled to assist Jewish non-repatriables. Yordim were not stateless, and therefore not the responsibility of the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees or international Jewish organizations. Instead, they represented a category that did not exist for Jews in the years immediately following the Holocaust. They were previously repatriated Jews. And ironically, only non-Jewish NGOs, ranging from the Christian Tolstoy Foundation to the International Rescue Committee and the anti-Zionist Rav Tov, remained the only organizations willing to assist Soviet Jewish emigres from Israel. On the coattails of Yordim emerged a new category of Soviet Jewish emigres. They were a product of Israel's aforementioned concerns over maintaining the repatriative Zionist character of Soviet Jewish migration and the clash of those concerns with the United States Cold War refugee policies. As it became abundantly clear to US congressmen that Jews were departing the Soviet state in increasing numbers, they embraced the same foreign policy objective that they had for Hungarians and subsequently Cubans. From the perspective of the United States, Soviet Jewish emigres were not merely Jews, but escapees from communism. Therefore, when a 1971 congressional bill proposed admitting Soviet Jews as refugees, it fit seamlessly with a decade and a half of American Cold War immigration policy. For Jewish nationalists, the bill resurrected many of the same concerns that the Zionist Organization of America had expressed over the DP Acts 20 years prior. Again, the organization affirmed that the bill threatened to, quote, divert attention from the efforts of Soviet Jews to emigrate to Israel, end quote. Although the bill failed, the cat was out of the bag, so to speak. The USA was willing to take in Soviet Jews, albeit not as Jews, but as escapees from communism. That same year, Attorney General John Mitchell evaded congressional approval and affirmed a policy allowing Soviet Jews to enter the US as paroled Cold War refugees. The bureaucratically complex migration route that brought Soviet Jewish emigres to Vienna as stateless persons, and the new opportunity offered by the United States, now opened an avenue for Soviet Jewish immigration to the US. Soviet Jews who increasingly economized on this opportunity provided by the US were dubbed noshrim, the Hebrew word for those who dropped out. Soviet Jewish so-called Yordim had briefly unsettled and subsequently cemented Israel's authority over its own emigres, but so-called noshrim introduced a new dilemma. Stateless Soviet Jewish emigres were no longer simply future Israeli repatriates. They were also Cold War refugees. Israel initially expressed a diplomatic, as opposed to legal or ideological, opposition to noshrim. In 1970, before the United States opened opportunities for Soviet Jewish refugeehood, Nehemiah Lebanon, the president of Nativ, privately informed Hayes and the JDC that he rejected any push that might lead Soviet Jews to immigrate to states other than Israel. Lebanon argued such a campaign would intertwine the Soviet Jewish case with that of other Soviet minorities who boasted diaspora communities outside the USSR, such as Ukrainians, Latvians, or Lithuanians. To remain kosher, again pun intended, in the eyes of the Soviet Union, the emigration had to remain a Jewish repatriation. If it did not, the future of Jewish emigration from the USSR, which permitted emigration only in the case of repatriation and family reunification, might meet, according to Lebanon, a premature end. This was an argument that Nativ and the Israeli government would resurrect in decades to come. But despite Lebanon's hostility towards campaigns for Soviet Jews' freedom of immigration, Lebanon stopped short of asserting that the Israeli government could actively prevent Soviet Jews from immigrating to the US or other Western states. But as the aforementioned Soviet Jewish emigres from Israel began to accumulate in Rome and even trickle into Belgium and Vienna, the Israeli government recognized that the presence of Yordim across the European continent did not bode well for Israel's reputation as a guarantor of Jewish safety and sovereignty. And therefore, in 1972, the Jewish Agency of Israel formally communicated to Hayes and the JDC its, quote, preference that people who may decide to leave Israel later should change their direction in Vienna, thus saving substantial expenses in their integration in Israel, as well as embarrassment and other difficulties, end quote. Indeed, within months, the number of Soviet Jews choosing to dispose of their Israeli visas in Rome and remain stateless increased by a factor of 5. Ironically, the opportunity to economize on the United States Cold War immigration policies, a prospect which just 2 years earlier the Israeli government had rejected, now emerged partly of Israel's own suggestion. You may ask yourselves, as I did during this process, where was the United Nations that had set the standard for managing situations such as these? By the fall of 1973, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees finally weighed in on the matter of Soviet Jewish refugiehood and Israeli sovereignty. Its conclusions followed the logic of repatriations and nation states even more stringently than the Israeli government. Just 20 years earlier, the UN had deemed Jews as a model for the unrepatriable refugee. But the Commission's statement on stateless Soviet Jews revealed the extent to which the existence of Israel had nationalized Jewish mobility in the eyes of the international community. The UNHCR agreed that Soviet Jewish emigres met some criteria of refugiehood. Their experiences in the USSR proved that they demonstrated a well-rounded fear of persecution. It was the degree of Soviet Jews' statelessness that the UN now questioned. Did Soviet Jews meet this criteria for refugiehood? Were they, as the third criteria states, unable or unwilling to avail themselves of the protection of the government of the country of their nationality? End quote. Grouping Noshrim and Yordim into a single category, the UN decided that the mere availability of Israeli governmental protection for Soviet Jews, even stateless Soviet Jews, was enough to preclude the UN from providing Soviet Jews with any international protection. And in fact, doing so would put the UN in the position of violating the rights of the state, in this case of Israel, which the UN accepted in this report as claiming, quote, full responsibility to protect and represent all Jewish people, end quote. By taking itself and its regulation of post-war international mobility out of the equation, the UN left the future of stateless Soviet Jews up to negotiation between the United States, Israel, and international Jewish NGOs. On one hand, as the 1970s progressed, the opportunity for Soviet Jews to dispose of their Israeli visas and change course in Vienna led to the successful reduction of Soviet Jewish emigres from Israel. On the other hand, the number of dropouts, or noshrim, grew exponentially. By the middle of the decade, more Soviet Jews chose to apply for refugee status in the United States than to accept the benefits of immediate Israeli citizenship. Once deemed the solution to Yordim, noshrim only fueled the ideological clash between Israel, the United States, and American Jewish organizations. The terms of debate had now become clear. Would the United States and American Jewish organizations follow the United Nations and bind Jewish migration to the repatriation model, or would they affirm Soviet Jews' right to the freedom of choice in the realm of not only emigration, as was popular to do, but also in immigration? For the United States, the choice was informed more by the nuances of diplomacy than any moral dedication to the matter. By the mid-1970s, in the face of the OPEC crisis, it was convenient for the United States government to fund Soviet Jewish immigration only to the United States. In a recently declassified 1974 decision to allocate $5 million to private organizations resettling Soviet Jews in the United States, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger noted that, quote, Arab countries are unlikely to criticize our willingness to help Soviet Jews settle outside of Israel, end quote. A 1975 proposed congressional bill, which would have offered funding only to Soviet Jews leaving for Israel, was deeply criticized by the State Department through private channels, as any push of Soviet Jews to Israel by the US could, quote, give the United States trouble with the Arabs, end quote. As a solution, the State Department suggested funding noshrim instead. The Israeli government, dependent on the United States for military assistance in the strained years following the devastation of the Yom Kippur War, was limited in its ability to debate the United States on this issue. Instead, Israel re-engaged Hayes and the JDC, now busily overseeing stateless Soviet Jews' transit between Vienna, Rome, and the United States, tens of thousands every year. In the years when the USSR constricted Soviet Jewish emigration or released an unusually large amount of refusals for exit visas, representatives of the Israeli government would typically claim that American Jewish organizations' involvement in this migration process was the root of such restrictions. In private exchanges, members of the Israeli government urged Hayes and the JDC to campaign for a stricter application of refugee status to Soviet Jews. In 1976, a committee of representatives from Hayes, the JDC, and the Israeli government assembled in Jerusalem to try furnish a solution. The two found that their disagreement was inherently ideological. Like the USSR and the UN, members of the Jewish Agency for Israel believed that repatriation should be the guiding philosophy of Jewish immigration. American Jewish philanthropic organizations, however, consistently emphasized the liberal notion of the freedom of movement. The committee parted ways with no solution. But in the process, the very existence of this committee angered both American Jews and Soviet Jews who caught wind of it. Hayas and JDC offices, Israeli newspapers, and American Jewish organizations campaigning on behalf of Soviet Jews received letters denouncing the Israeli government's attempted so-called coup over Soviet Jewish mobility. As one angered young man expressed, "I am a Zionist, but official Zionist principles, which protect the rights of Jews everywhere, hardly translate to the right of the State of Israel to force Jews to live in Israel." Similarly, 28 prominent leaders of the Jewish national movement in the USSR, such as Natan Sharansky, Vladimir Slepak, and Alexander Lerner, drafted a petition emphasizing that Soviet Jews' freedom of movement in both emigration and immigration should always take priority in any action plan. Controlled immigration to Israel was, of course, vital, but a secondary concern. Noshrim continued their paths from the USSR to Vienna to Rome to the United States undeterred. Only at the turn of the decade did the Israeli government make its most daring push to regulate Soviet Jewish migration. By 1980, it seemed as though Nehemiah Lebanon's conjecture from 10 years prior, that the Soviet Union would cut Jewish emigration if it found that Soviet Jews strayed from the path of Israeli repatriation, has come true. As you can see here, between 1979 and 1980, the Soviet Union's distribution of exit visas to its Jewish citizens fell by over 50%. In reality, this crackdown on emigration had little to do with Soviet Jews' overwhelming decision to abscond to Israel for the United States. In a private conversation with American businessman Armand Hammer, a close friend of Leonid Brezhnev's, Brezhnev affirmed that he could, quote, not care less, end quote, where Soviet Jews immigrated. The decision to suppress Jewish emigration was far more intertwined with the collapse of the Cold War détente between the United States and the USSR. In the same year, President Jimmy Carter signed into law the United States' most expansive Refugee Act. The new legislation raised the Immigration and Naturalization Services refugee ceiling and widened the criteria for who qualified as a refugee. Even as avenues for Jewish emigration from the Soviet Union threatened to disappear, the Soviet Jewish road into the United States had never been more open. These new circumstances birthed a debate that opened today's talk. The international community and Jewish organizations had already accepted that Yordim were not refugees. Noshrim now stood at the precipice of the same fate. In the late winter of 1980, Leon Dulcin, the chairman of the Jewish Agency for Israel, announced that stateless Soviet Jews who arrived in Vienna with Israeli visas were not refugees and did not deserve to be treated as such. Dulcin's statement, though radical in the eyes of American Jews, actually aligned with the aforementioned conclusions reached by the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees almost a decade prior. But neither Hayas nor the JDC was willing to accept these claims. The organization's leader began to parse the legal differences between the possession of a national visa and the possession of a nationality. Moreover, both organizations claimed that the United States' newest Refugee Act could now even confer refugee status upon the long-forgotten Yordim. The legislation allowed the American government to ascertain whether a refugee had been firmly resettled in a state, and therefore, in the case of Yordim, dispute the validity of the Israeli citizenship that they possessed. Hayas and the JDC left the Jewish Agency with little legal recourse. The office of the Israeli Prime Minister seized the reins of the argument from the Jewish Agency. Jewish refugeehood, it argued, was beyond the formal legal determination of the United States or the United Nations. Instead, Jewish refugeehood was, quote, a moral Jewish position, end quote, to be decided by Jews and among Jews. American Jewish organizations and the Israeli government were no longer speaking the same language. As the Soviet Union continued to restrict Jewish emigration, by 1982, the Israeli government convinced Hayas and the JDC that the last remaining method of resurrecting Soviet Jewish emigration was to reascertain that Israel would be the only destination accessible to Soviet Jewish emigres. the two organizations accepted a 3-month trial period in which they would not assist Soviet Jews who were stateless in Vienna and had elected to drop out of their journey to Israel. Condemnations immediately came to the surface, this time from Western European states. Both Austria and the Netherlands accused Jewish organizations and the Israeli government of violating the freedom of choice doctrine that the post-war era had supposedly promised stateless refugees. Their opposition was quickly quelled by the fact that the 3-month trial failed to increase Jewish emigration from the USSR, and therefore Hayes and the JDC quickly reopened their doors to the trickle of Soviet Jews who successfully reaped exit visas in the mid-1980s. Only Gorbachev's rise to power in the Soviet Union and his subsequent liberalization of Soviet society reopened the doors for Soviet Jewish emigration. And for 2 years, Soviet Jews discarded Israeli visas in Vienna at a rate higher than ever before, all in exchange for American refugee status. Despite the arrows that flew between American Jewish philanthropic organizations and the Israeli government on the subject of Soviet Jewish immigration for over 2 decades, it was the United States that ended the battle in favor of Israel. By the fall of 1989, it had become increasingly clear that the United States would emerge as the victor of the Cold War. And when the flow of Soviet Jewish refugees began to overwhelm the budgetary constraints of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the Bush administration foresaw no diplomatic returns on investing any further in the Cold War refugee apparatus. Because Gorbachev expanded the civil rights of Soviet citizens, he inadvertently opened the public sphere to blatant anti-Semitic Russian nationalist groups, which only increased de facto anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union during this time period, which would have theoretically strengthened Soviet Jews' case for refugiehood. And yet, by 1990, Soviet Jews had lost their access to American refugee status. And as their days as Cold War refugees ended, Soviet Jews' overwhelming future as Israeli repatriates was largely set. Between 1990 and 1992, more Jews left the USSR and the post-Soviet states for Israel than had ever acquired American refugee status. We've covered quite a bit of ground here today, so I want to take us through what I've tried to convince you of. After the Second World War, Europe and the newly emergent United Nations made repatriation the foundation of post-war mobility. But the circumstances afflicting Jewish Holocaust survivors had forced the creation of modern refugiehood as an alternative to the repatriative norm. And the subsequent creation of a Jewish nation state in Israel offered to recalibrate Jewish mobility with this international repatriative standard. But the mass emigration of Soviet Jews forced American Jewish philanthropic organizations to realize that despite their overwhelming support for Zionism, they were not interested in broadening these sympathies to include relinquishing control over Jewish mobility. They found an unlikely partner in the American government, for whom supporting Soviet Jews' freedom of emigration and immigration bolstered its Cold War diplomacy. But the Cold War merely extended Jews' unique post-war access to non-repatriative immigration, and it was the Cold War's untimely end that officially and firmly bound Jewish refugees' future mobility to the Jewish nation state. Thank you so much, everyone. This was such a pleasure.
Thank you, Sasha, for this extremely interesting lecture. We'll now open the floor to questions. Please remember that the microphones are muted. You can send us your question via the Q&A function. And Sasha, I see we already have 2 questions, so let's see what they are. The first question is, considering all of the tensions over Jewish immigration, to what extent do you think the Soviet Jewry movement should be understood as a national movement?
Can I ask a clarifying question? Do they mean the Soviet Jewry movement in the United States or the Jewish national movement in the Soviet Union?
So I will give a second to the person to send a clarification, and I'll go to the next question, and we'll come back to this one in a bit.
Okay, sounds good.
Oh, actually, the person sent a clarification, either or both. So I guess it's up to you, Sasha.
Okay. So I would say that the term national very much fits the Soviet Jewry movement or the Jewish movement in the USSR throughout the time period, as it really had these clauses of repatriation in mind. If you read a lot of the self-published literature from famous Jewish refuseniks that lived in the Soviet Union, they are very interested in returning to Israel because they see it as their national home. The Soviet Jewry movement in the United States, I would argue, is a little bit more complicated because, as recent research has shown, it didn't necessarily just have this national bend, but it was also very much a reaction to the growing insularity of politics in the 1970s in the United States. Historians have described the American Soviet Jewry partially as a response to the emergence of the Black Panther movement, which led very much to more of an insular approach to civil rights among African American communities in the United States and inspired American Jews to do the same. There's also been recent work by Shaul Kellner that actually just came out that very much argued that the Soviet Jewry movement in the United States was really central to the formation of American Jewish identity more broadly, not necessarily just in a national sense, but in terms of trying to ascertain what Jewish American identity specifically looked like, what they owed to Jews outside of the United States, and also squaring what they owed or did not owe to Israel.
Thank you. The next question is, didn't the hijacking of the train in Austria change how Austria looked at these refugees, eating options for them? So I'm not too sure.
I know what it means and I can answer it.
Okay, so if you can tell the audience a bit more as well, because I don't
Yes.
think everyone knows what the context is.
So, what this person is asking is throughout the 1970s, there were several attacks on Soviet Jews in transit, um, largely coming out of the Middle East and from terrorist organizations from the Middle East that essentially tried to deter Jewish movement to the Levant. You kind of heard me talk about that a little bit briefly when I discussed Henry Kissinger and Henry Kissinger's fear about so-called angering Arabs by allowing Soviet Jews to move to the Levant and Israel. And it also played a part in Soviet diplomacy on the matter, which I didn't have the opportunity to talk about today. But the Soviet Union was very worried throughout the 70s and the 60s and even into the 80s that they would anger Arab states and the Arab League by allowing Jews to leave the Soviet Union for Israel. So they were kind of balancing a lot of diplomacy there. And one of the most important events was a bombing of a train. The year is escaping me. I believe it was 1973, but don't confuse me. There were many, but this was the most famous that led Bruno Kreisky to seriously reconsider whether Austria was going to be a transit point for Soviet Jews, as he saw it as a risk to not only Soviet Jewish, but Austrian security, but eventually changed his mind. And there was actually a lot more security forces that would then be stationed at the Vienna Südbahnhof. And actually, this is really interesting to see in oral histories, a lot of Soviet Jews' first memories getting off the train in Vienna is seeing these military and policemen who were theoretically staged to prevent such future terrorist attacks.
Thank you, Dasha. Okay, so the next question, I'm trying to group them a little bit. Can you talk about why Yordim were leaving Israel and what they were unhappy with?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? It blanked out.
Can you talk a bit more about why Yordim were leaving Israel and what they were unhappy with?
Yeah, so I mentioned it briefly in my talk, and I know I talk very quickly, so I apologize if this didn't fully get delivered. But Soviet Jews are leaving Israel specifically in the early 1970s for a couple of reasons. And also, it depends on where in the Soviet Union they're coming from. The classic example that I give that Georgian Jews who are arriving in Israel throughout this time period are very frustrated by two things. One, that they're not being resettled specifically in Jerusalem, because Georgian Jews are a lot more religious and they really saw the return to Israel not necessarily as a national movement, but very much more of a religious pilgrimage. And so there's a lot of frustration that specifically Jerusalem, the Holy Land, is not the site of resettlement, and also that they're not being resettled together as a community and are getting more spread out. So that's one frustration. Another is in the 1970s, Israel's tech and white collar work, specifically in science and engineering, was not particularly developed, but the majority of Soviet, or not the majority, but the disproportionate amount of Soviet Jews who are coming to Israel during this time period do have these STEM degrees. So there's almost an economic misalignment for these Jews. And finally, there was the debate surrounding mixed marriages. There were individuals who were able to receive exit visas from the Soviet Union, but then had trouble gaining Israeli citizenship because even though they might have been a Jew or qualified to be Jewish enough to gain an exit visa from the Soviet Union, they weren't as able to carefully negotiate the attainment of Israeli citizenship in such mixed marriages. Funnily enough, and I've never quite known what to do with this, but in a lot of the surveys taken by Hayes and the JDC throughout this time period, the majority response for your dean for why they leave Israel is climate. And I've never quite known what to do with that. It feels like, don't get me wrong, I hate the sun as much as the next girl, but I've never, I don't know if it's ever inspired me to give up my citizenship to somewhere.
And that's really interesting. I think, I don't know, I think, yeah, for some people it's important. In your research, did you find minutes of internal debates over the issues within the JDC board of directors, for example? So I guess that's an example, and maybe internal debates within other organizations, or I don't know if you want to elaborate on this.
Yes. So some of the quotes that I was able to draw from, specifically about the debate between the two JDC representatives in the 1970s, with one claiming that the JDC had no moral obligation to Soviet Jews who had left Israel, and the other who's trying to kind of harken back to the earlier period of the 40s and 50s of emigres from Israel and saying, look, this didn't work the first time. We got to do something different this time around. So some of these exchanges actually first play out in the board of directors meetings and eventually kind of filter their way into these larger meetings that subsequently include Hayes or Israeli representatives.
Wasn't there also the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which traded grain for Soviet Jews? How did that impact the immigration?
Yeah, so the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, for those who are unfamiliar, essentially what it tried to do, and it's particularly important to think about when it tried to do this. This is the era of détente, the 1970s, a cooling of tensions, so to speak, between the Soviet Union and the United States. And the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which is introduced by Henry Scoop Jackson, really kind of foils this plan a little bit or attempts to foil this plan of reducing tensions. And what essentially it tries to do is to target the Soviet Union's most favored nation trading status with the United States by claiming that any state that restricts the emigration of its citizens, very much a pointed attack on the Soviet Union at this point, with Soviet Jews being a very popular topic, would no longer qualify for most favored nation status. In some ways, this impacted the emigration by bringing more attention to it. But if you look at internal documents from the National Archives, and especially folks like Henry Kissinger, who were, as this has been long debated, but as kind of I was able to show here, Henry Kissinger did play a role in assisting this emigration come to fruition, was very upset that the topic had been brought to the public sphere via the Jackson-Vanik Amendment.
So someone who worked for Hayes, I think during those years, is asking, didn't the Federal Office of Refugee Settlement, ORR, monies granted around 1989 and beyond to Hayes play a big role in bringing in more Soviet Jews? Millions of dollars were sent to Jewish organizations around the country via the Council of Jewish Federations and Hayes. I don't know if you want to comment on this.
Yes. Yes, that is completely correct. But a lot of these monies were less used to, as I said earlier, bring in new refugees and more to resettle those who were already waiting in Rome to enter the United States and subsequently to settle them across Jewish communities in the United States. There's some really great highest collections that shows how this process happened and how various Jewish organizations, ranging from like the Jewish Federation of Families to JCCs, would kind of vie for these monies and subsequently say, okay, I will take 10 Soviet Jews for Milwaukee, or I'll take 100 for Cleveland. And that's where the majority of that money was going, specifically for resettlement and those already in Rome, as opposed to continuing that process, because there was
So
quite a lag.
thank you, thank you. I'm really going to ask you maybe two more questions, and any questions that I don't have a chance to ask you, I will forward to Sasha, who then can respond to you. When Italy and Austria agreed to serve as transit points, did their government take a position at all regarding the debates over refugee or non-refugee status of the Jews? Or did they stay out of it and let the US, Israel, American Jews, and the UN hash it out?
Yes. So they took less position. Austria and the Netherlands, not Italy, were the states that had the hottest takes, to use Gen Z lingo, on the refugee or non-refugee status of Soviet Jews. Austria in particular, and Bruno Kreisky in particular in 1973, gets into this absolutely savage debate with Golda Meir on whether Soviet Jews who are stateless in Vienna qualify as refugees, how quickly they should be allowed to meet with the Jewish Agency for Israel before they cast their decision on whether they're going to try garner refugee status in the United States or immediately accept Israeli citizenship. It eventually, Bruno Kreisky actually gets so frustrated by this question of refugeehood or no refugeehood for Soviet Jews that he briefly suspends the use of Austria as a transit point. Um, and actually ends up playing a very active role in the presence of Hayes and the JDC and really creating the resources for Soviet Jews to make a so-called choice on where they want to go. The Netherlands is initially very hesitant to issue any directives on what their take is. They're in a very tenuous position because they're representing Israel and the Soviet Union. But by the late 1980s, they are so angry with Israel when Israel tries to get rid of Austria as a transit point and to negotiate direct flights between out of the Soviet Union to Tel Aviv. So there is no stateless loophole anymore. And the Netherlands has a total field day about it. But to be perfectly frank, the Soviet Union then falls and they become bigger fish to fry than whether there's going to be direct flights from the Soviet Union to Israel.
Do you know any cases of Soviet refugees who went to the US and then ultimately went to Israel? So I guess the opposite of the cases you've been discussing today.
So, to be perfectly honest, I would say the majority of those cases happened in the 90s and early 2000s. I'm sure there are a few exceptions of folks who moved to Israel in the 70s and 80s. That's not necessarily something I have access to because I think some of that information would require me to do additional archival research. But there has definitely been, particularly in the last 30 years, a huge movement, a really significant movement of Soviet Jews who originally resettled in Israel, resettled in the United States, end up developing a lot more Israeli nationalism while here, and subsequently leaving for Israel.
That's very interesting. So I'm going to end up with lighter questions, maybe. One is, how did you become interested in this topic? And second, do you have any publication about your research?
So how did I become interested in this topic? I mean, I'll put all my cards on the table and say that my parents are from the former Soviet Union, but that's not necessarily what drove me to this topic. I've always been very interested in the history of refugeehood. It's something that I grew pretty attached to as an undergraduate. And the Soviet Jewish case always particularly intrigued me because in stories of refugeehood and the United Nations, the international communities, or states' ability to manage displaced persons is typically a failure post World War II. It seems as though the number of refugees is constantly growing. And Soviet Jews, for me, shockingly, were a very successful migration. And that's quite unusual in the span of history. And I was very interested in what circumstances needed to align for a migration to be deemed successful. And the last point of interest for this topic was I could never quite square in my mind mentally a lot of the cultural associations between Ashkenazi Jewish identity in the United States and its connections to Russia. Every time I say that my parents are from Moscow, I'll have an American Jew say to me, "Oh, I'm a Russian Jew too." And I'll say, "Oh, where are your parents from?" And they say, "Don't know. It was 120 years ago." And to look back and see that this center of Russian Jewry didn't really exist as the locus that it had for several centuries was always shocking to me. And I thought to myself, how did that locus almost disappear? That's not to say there isn't a significant Jewish community in Russia and Ukraine right now, but not nearly to the demographic extreme that there had been for the last 200 years.
Very interesting. And in terms of publications, do you have any plans?
Yes. So this presentation that you had the opportunity to see today is a part of my dissertation, as David Musher mentioned earlier, which is preliminarily titled "Should I Stay or Should I Go? Jewish Repatriation, Family Reunification, and Emigration from the USSR." I have an article from earlier in the dissertation that is currently in the phases of going through academic publication. I'm currently waiting to hear back from peer reviewers on that. So hopefully eventually that'll be out there. And actually the presentation that you had the opportunity to hear today, I will be transforming into an article. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. So that'll be my project for the next couple months. And I also publish blog posts with the Blavatnik archive. So you can find stuff.
I certainly enjoyed your presentation very much. Thank you again, Sasha, and thank you to all our participants for joining us today. I also want to give a special thanks to Ruth and David Musher for enduring this fellowship and making this presentation possible. Our next program will take place on September 3rd. Dr. Daniela Spencer will present her new book, Echoes of Exile, A Family's Odyssey Through the Holocaust and the Cold War. Invitations will be sent out in August, but you can already register via our website. I believe that the link has just been put in the chat. Please sign up also for our e-newsletter if you would like to receive invitation to other public programs. Thank you, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you in September.
Thank you so much.